Okay, so I have Tra-ill Dowie with me, Dr. Tra-ill Dowie, and very excited to have you here, Tra-ill. Thank you very much for joining me. We're here to discuss your article published in Psychotherapy and Counseling Today in December 2022. The article entitled "An Integrated Approach to Trauma Treatment, Part 1, Foundations of Theory." And co-authored with Nigel Denning. So, Tra-ill, I'd like to approach our discussion by really scaffolding, and this is something I'm going to be trying to do in all the videos for this channel. Really scaffolding our discussion so that there's something in this for everybody. So, something for the general public, something for students of this subject, psychotherapy and mental health, and particularly trauma, and then, something in this for professionals as well. So perhaps we can just begin, at the foundation, just maybe speak a little about what psychotherapy is, its relation to psychology and psychiatry.
Yeah, all right. Well, I mean, it's a contested term, isn't it, Josh? The notion of psychotherapy. It can, in some ways, be used to describe all therapies which are psychological in nature. It could be used in that way, and often is. I think I would imagine that you would think about this slightly differently, in the sense that we would think about psychotherapy as a practice which has its origins in the analytic tradition, emerging out of the clinic, out of theory drawn from direct experience, versus psychology, which is really developed out of a lab, out of the research around the human mind. And psychiatry, I guess, has a long and configured history around all these factors as well. Psychiatry is the form of medicine which deals with this. For many years, psychiatrists were extensively trained in psychoanalysis. Many of them still are around the world. In countries like Australia, there are specializations in psychiatry still in psychotherapy. So, in some ways, psychiatry, is a much broader term. But, for me, all of these traditions, if we can call them that, are really trying to take seriously certain problems of human living that may have to do with the human mind. And that, of course, is a complex problem, because when I say that, I don't just mean something that's kind of simply enskulled, or something which is merely the matter between your ears. Rather, these problems of living which organize human lives in fundamental ways. And in that sense, psychiatry is the black sheep in many ways of the medicine family, because it sits in these funny spaces in between, where things like psychotherapy, understanding psychosomatic disorders, all these other areas which don't really fit perfectly well into a hard science, kind of remain. So I think all of these traditions are doing something important. They all offer something different. The nature of that difference is often poorly articulated, but I think it's something that we could discuss more.
Great. Thank you for that grounding, Tra-ill.
Mm.
So the next thing I just wanted to transition to as a kind of foundation for this discussion is trauma. And you often have obviously an extensive definition and exposition of trauma. So at this point, what I'm just wanting to kind of maybe suggest we explore is just trauma as a form of psychological suffering.
Mm.
And how that term psychological suffering is different to the term mental illness. And then I guess where I'm suggesting we take this kind of early part of the discussion is some mention of the DSM, and maybe why we need to go beyond something like the DSM when discussing things like psychological suffering, mental illness, but particularly trauma.
Yeah. Well, I mean, trauma is an interesting idea. It has developed a popular psychological value in recent times, which is both great that we're paying attention to it, but also it comes with a certain night side. It certainly comes with its own problems, the popularization, because in some sense, we're in a situation now where everybody in some ways can be or is described in relationship to being traumatized. And I think there's a real problem with that. I think when a term means everything, then it means nothing. And so the word trauma from the Greek trauma, is a wound. And obviously that has direct, importance for medicine, and traumatology as a specialization in medicine is very important in critical care and whatnot. But when we talk about it psychologically, I think the real issue of categorization is, how do we define this idea in a meaningful way that doesn't just have it disappear and it become a pseudonym for suffering, a pseudonym for pain, a pseudonym for grief, a pseudonym for any other form of psychological distress. And I think that that's a very important piece. And I think that that's something that the popularization of it as an idea has created some problems with.
Mm, mm. Thank you, Tra. So I'm wanting maybe to pay a little more attention to the idea again of the DSM, the idea of not wanting to make this about the DSM, but also just wanting to be clear that trauma kind of really received a certain kind of legitimacy with the emergence of the PTSD diagnosis, the inclusion of
Yeah.
that in the DSM,
Yeah.
understanding what the DSM is as a kind of an organization of symptoms into diagnostic categories,
Mm.
how that doesn't give us, and this is the problem of the mind in general, the ability to look underneath the hood, peer underneath the hood as to what the underlying causative kind of factor is, the thing that's making those symptoms appear. Um, I mean, and just to note that you in your article, you mentioned symptoms of trauma, things like dissociation, fugue, hallucination, anxiety, depression, dysregulation, and then extreme interpersonal and personality disruption. So it's not that like attention to symptoms is not important, but you're wanting to
Absolutely.
go beyond just a description of symptoms, right?
Well, a description is not an understanding of.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would argue that the treatment of trauma in many ways has become misunderstood because of some of these readings. There's a tendency, for example, to want to reduce trauma to a series of symptoms which are caused by problems within the memory system, and therefore merely exposing people in appropriate ways to the traumatized, unprocessed memory creates healing. And that's all very good and well. And I think that, exposure work and memory work is an essential feature of trauma practice. But there are other pieces that are very, very important. And, just a simple example of that might be to say something like the role of the relational field. What does it mean to work with people who have not just single index trauma, but rather have a lifetime of trauma of omission and commission that has disrupted the formation of the foundations of who they are. And in doing that, it's not just the question of memory, but it's the context of relationship in which the memory is explored in. And so, if at the heart of trauma is a loss of autonomy and often ruptures of relationship, I would very strenuously make the argument that the first point of call is the role of relational connectivity and support, which generates safety, that then allows that person to experience their own agency and autonomy in a safe environment. And so those features are kind of underdone in much of the popular conversation. Now, I think it's present, in certainly the works of Alan Shaw. It's right up front in that work. I think it's present in Dan Siegel's work. I think Russell Mears, who perhaps doesn't get enough attention around that work, has a lot to say as well. And in some ways, his work, in my opinion, holds this together in a more realistic way for longitudinal treatment. And I think those factors are really important when we're talking about description versus understanding. It's important to say that understanding is not just important because of what it allows you to do in terms of the accuracy of your treatment plan. No, understanding is the treatment. To understand the person is the treatment. That is part of what makes the person heal, is being understood. And I think there's very, 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 very few people that really grasp that role of this kind of, to use Shaw's kind of idea of this right hemisphere to right hemispheric attunement that sits as the basis of everything that we do. And that all the other pieces have to flow out of that in a meaningful way.
This question of understanding seems to me to be really central, and it was a beautiful articulation of what I'd been kind of thinking in anticipation of our discussion. And so it's like it's not enough to open, it's just going back to that analogy of like when there's something wrong with the car, you open the hood, you take a look at the engine. We don't have that, well, some people would want to say that we do have that ability. We can look at the brain, we understand trauma, but you're saying no, that's not what understanding is in this context.
No, exactly. And I'd even go further than that, Josh. I mean, with the neurobiology of it, look, I'm a big fan of neuroscience. I enjoy it. I find it fascinating. But there's just a fundamental epistemic kind of problem in the whole thing. How do you understand one thing by describing another thing? That to me, it can never arrive. It's the wrong level. It's the wrong level. Human beings do not encounter the world at the level of synapses. They encounter the world at the level of experience. And that should be our primary concern. Not to say that synapses aren't important, not to say that understanding the neuroscience can't improve your understanding. But if all you're trying to do is explain the person away at the wrong level of organization, it's a fool's errand, I think, actually.
So you're kind of speaking about a displacement of the task, or the task at hand, to just somewhere else. So in terms of speaking about understanding, and understanding is healing, you're really kind of, as you mentioned in your articles, speaking about complexity, and you have to stay with the complex without trying to reduce the complex to the simple. And there's that wonderful quote by Paul Valéry that you cite: "Everything simple is false, everything complex is unusable." And so it seems like we're in this map territory kind of place where we're trying to find a map that's adequate to the territory, that's neither too simple nor too complex, but an adequate map.
Exactly. And so, if you think about this idea, of dealing with this kind of conundrum, this dates all the way back to the foundations of our traditions. I mean, Carl Jaspers famously spoke about this notion of grasping the patient, grasping them, this kind of capacity to try and get a hold of the qualities but always knowing that it's never a completed task. I'm very fond of saying that it's always a Beckettian failure. Hardy Lang puts that very beautifully in The Politics of Experience. He says, my experience of your experience is my experience of your behavior. And so I can never fully know your experience. I mean, it reminds me of Nagel's famous essay on what it's like to be a bat. Even when we're imagining what it's like to be a bat, we're imagining what it's like to be a bat as a human. We can never actually know the experience. And in some ways, that is the fate of all people as well, that each unique subjectivity can never fully be grasped. It's always an approximation. Alfred Schutz, the social phenomenologist, said that no true intersubjective intercourse is possible. It's never possible to get an exact one-to-one reading of another's experience. And so psychotherapy is a constant negotiation of approximations. And it requires a great deal of skill and sensitivity to navigate that.
Very good. Thank you, Tra-ill. I think we're kind of getting to the end of the introductory part of this this interview and discussion. And so I think a good this is a good moment to really kind of speak about your map of trauma. It's the map you provide at the end of the introduction to your article. And it's the map of trauma as a general category. And you write that trauma may be conceptualized as a disorder of 1, time, 2, defense, 3, relationality and communicability, 4, memory, 5, resource, and 6, agency. And following this kind of articulation, you then go into section 2, what is effectively section 2 of the article, and you address the question, what is mind? Just a small, modest question, of course. And you begin with this quote from Daniel Siegel. Well, you may not begin with it, but it's certainly there as a reference point. And I'll just read it quickly. According to Daniel Siegel, so mind can be defined as, and this is the quote, an embodied, relational, self-organizing, emergent process that regulates the flow of energy and information both within and between. And then you go on to make reference to Merleau-Ponty and the enactivism of Maturana and Varela, just to give some intellectual context here. But then you go into your definition, which is an enormously expanded version of Siegel, very ambitious and fascinating definition of mind. I'm just going to read it directly from the article here. So it's quite an extensive definition, so bear with me. Mind is an embodied, relational, negentropic process, which is energetic and informatic in nature. Mind is preserved against entropy by its organizational characteristics. Thus, the mind is temporal in the sense that the informatic qualities of mind are propagated forward in time. Mind is ecological in its features in the sense that it is characterized by feedback loops and interconnected non-linear processes and patterns of heterarchies and hierarchies. A mind also possesses, beg your pardon, expressive, regulatory, and generative features. In this sense, the mind demonstrates autopoietic qualities and is inactive. In this sense, life and mind become processes where the characteristics of life may be defined simplistically as the self-organization of energy, and mind may be framed as the self-organization of information. This organizational process in humans has features that are stable in organization, that are termed stages, and non-stable processes that are termed states. Both stages and states exhibit unique energetic and informatic qualities. with complexity of energetic informatic organization and significant coherence, mind develops as well as emerges from structures of biology in an embodied context and situatedness. Mind thus has properties that can act in both a top-down and bottom-up manner, as well as inside to outside and outside to inside manner. The mind is not epiphenomenal, rather the mind is central to many living beings, and there are many kinds of minds with varying complexities. Sufficiently complex and cohered minds form a process, pattern, or coherence termed a self that produces subjective phenomenal experience. Okay, we've taken a great big leap into another order of intellectual engagement with this quote. So trying to just keep that kind of spirit of scaffolding and openness to people of all registers. I just wanted to pose this question about this. Can you just speak a little about the evolution of your thinking in regards to this? Where are your influences here?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is, isn't it extraordinary that this topic is not front and center in so much of what constitutes psychotherapy or psychological practice? I mean, a definition of mind, it seems unimportant in many of these traditions. And I often say it's a bit like a carpenter saying they need to know nothing about wood. I mean, it's extraordinary. So, I do take it very seriously because I think first principles have a massive impact on outcomes. And so I think ontologies and epistemologies are essential foundations for any praxis. So, I do want to take the time to kind of do this. If we're talking about, what's informed this, well, I guess I come to something like this, I guess, first and foremost within a philosophy of, within a philosophical tradition. So both philosophy of mind, but in particular, some of the continental philosophy, which emerged into the inactivist movement, as you spoke about earlier, kind of important contributors. Been very, very interested for a long time in systems and complexity science and thinking. And there's a lot of attention to this in various ways throughout what I've written there that you read out, and really trying to find a way of bringing what we might say is contemporary best understandings to bear in a meaningful way, and trying to organize these things in a meaningful way. And you're right. I mean, this is a very dense piece of writing, in the sense that each sentence in some ways could be its own journal article or its own paper. But what I'm really trying to get to here is to elicit, at least from the beginning, and I wouldn't ever suggest that this is accurate or complete or a total account. It is something which is, as you said, very ambitious, but it is more than that. It's just a starting point. It's some form of diligent thinking about what we're talking about, and then trying to build ourselves up from the basis of some sound thinking. So these ideas, in particular, these ideas of complex, open, self-organizing systems, drawing on Bonvitta-Lanfrey, drawing on Weaver, drawing on those ideas in contemporary complexity science to try and make something at least philosophically sound to begin with. I mean, I guess the person, it's interesting. Every time I talk about this, the person who I always don't mention is Gregory Bateson, yet he's probably the person who's most important all the time. It's such a strange thing. So I would say, what is this? In some ways, I'm trying to make an extension of Bateson and Bateson's original kind of ideas around mind.
Yeah. And the word ecology there is, of course, very important. Like, the interrelatedness of mind as part of an interrelated field, not only of knowledge systems, but of ontologies, I guess.
That's right. And I think that's a very important piece. And perhaps that's not something which is, clearly enough articulated.
Yeah. So I was thinking that we might spend some time on this definition,
Yeah.
um, and just I mean, one thing to consider here is the question of and we've drawn attention to the ecology of this, and you complexity science. You've got feedback systems, so cybernetics is in there. Um,
Mm.
what is the importance of the reference to nonlinear processes and patterns of both hetarchy and hierarchy? Why are both those words in there? What are you trying to say?
Well, obviously hierarchy everyone's familiar with, right? These are organizational orders. Heterarchies not only non-ordered, but rather types of ordering where there can be a multitude of orders at any one time. And I think that that's kind of important when we're thinking about this. Was there is a tendency to want to just create simplicity all the time, simple hierarchies of organization. When I actually think that that's not the case. The question of nonlinearity, it throws into question so much of how we think about all of this, doesn't it? I mean, the idea that somehow this is understandable in a simple, logical, linear sequence, whilst appealing, is almost certainly wrong. There is so much more going on. And one of the questions on nonlinearity is to say that we get causation confused. Where causation occurs becomes problematic. And so we're starting to talk about recursive loops, starting to talk about some of these properties. Now, just a simple idea, one of the features of this is questions in science around retrocausation. Now, whilst, I'm not a physicist, and, the implications of retrocausation at a kind of, at a physical level are very, very profound, obviously. One of the things that strikes me about that when I read about that is just how regularly psychotherapy is engaged in a kind of retrocausation.
Okay, can you say more about
That's
that?
very well. There's the there and then there's a here and now. And so often we're doing things in the here and now, which are going to be influencing the there and then. And part of the configuration and the hierarchy of the human nervous system is, of course, is that not all of it is temporalized. So often parts of the nervous system which are impacted by things like trauma, particularly developmental trauma, may be resting outside of time in a very fundamental way. And yet, when you bring in the here and now experience, which creates restorative, reparative, different experiences, you think about the trauma patient who re-experiences a traumatic quality in the body, but brings that to some kind of completion, a la, somatic experiencing or something like that. In some ways, there's a kind of retrocausation that doing it here and now means I was doing it there and then. And so there's very strange kind of features around time that run through so much of this work. And I think that I'm sure we'll get to that at some point, but it's one of the defining characteristics of trauma work, I would say, is its relationship to time.
Yeah, well, you were basically just describing time travel there, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, that's what I mean. Time travel, when we talk about causation,
yeah.
it's in therapeutic sense, it's kind of possible
Yeah.
because we're not dealing with qualities within the human mind which are within a temporal stream a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds pretty kooky when you say it like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Great. The other thing that I was kind of, and there's just again, there's just so much in this your definition, if it can be called that, of mind. So we can't cover it all, but the one thing I am drawn to discuss is the kind of the parallel you generate between life and mind, where life is an organization of energy and mind is an organization of information. I think this is a really interesting kind of, yeah,
Yeah.
relationship that you're starting to kind of set up there. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously it's a little bit tongue in cheek, right? Because where there's energy, there's information, and where there's information, these things are conjoined, aren't they? Right. But I'm trying to make a point that perhaps when we see self-organizing systems, living systems, perhaps what we mean is that they're self-organizing energy in some way. That's one of the features of it. Now, what goes with that is the self-organization or the presence of mind. And probably what this means is that minds, in some form, are present in everything that's living. Now, I don't mean to exaggerate that or say that the mind, in the formal, detailed sense, which I've given a definition of it, there is always present. And that's obviously an attempt to try and arrive at something that's more like a human mind, or at least a mammalian mind. But it starts to kind of make suggestions then that at certain levels of complexity, then subjectivity, self-reflective consciousness, all these things might be features that begin to emerge. And I think this is very interesting when we look at other animals and consciousness. So one of the interesting things is, it seems that at least twice on Earth, highly intelligent organisms have been created, and on completely different kind of taxological kind of pathways. So octopi, whatever the right word is for it, are an incredibly intelligent creature, which we, divested from and split apart from, such a long time ago. Yet there's this kind of intelligence to these creatures. And, there's obviously, this kind of more familiar mammalian pathway that we're supposedly at the top of the tree. And so, yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it, to think about what has a mind, what constitutes a mind, and what levels of complexity of minds, should we take care of and pay attention to? Because what becomes almost self-evidence with that is a question of ethics. So much of our ethical approach is built upon an assumption about the value of human minds. So I guess that's a point that Peter Singer has kind of deliberated on pretty extensively and problematized in really powerful ways as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the next part of your definition of mind that I'd like to spend some time on is this idea of the mind having properties that can act in both top-down and bottom-up manner, as well as inside to outside and outside to inside. This seems to me to be a particularly unique contribution that you've brought to this. So it'd be great to have you speak to this.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the top-down, bottom-up thing is pretty well articulated, isn't it? I mean, there's the sense in which the functions of the neofrontal cortex are in operation, and they can have a downward effect on the nervous system, down regulating and whatnot. But there's also these bottom-up processes, these things that emerge from this substrate of the nervous system, qualities that we might, I guess, call somatic or sensate. It's probably the right way of talking about it. And if you think about the history of trauma treatment, I mean, we have a lot of people espousing the values of a cognitive behavioral model, which is essentially a top-down model. And yet there has been in recent times, a whole movement towards bottom-up models, sensorimotor processing, somatic experiencing, Hakomi, TRE. There's a whole bunch of them that have kind of come out. And so I think that's pretty evident that information can come from the top or it can come from the bottom, and the top and the bottom are in an interacting loop. So somatic qualities can have an effect on cognition and thought, and cognition and thought can have an effect on somatic properties. So there's an interconnection there. The inside to the outside, I think, makes pretty obvious sense for most people. Makes pretty obvious sense that the features of mind itself move from the subjective experience of most people from the inside to the outside. And I mean, I don't know if that needs more explanation, but that seems pretty self-evident as well. But the one that kind of sometimes confuses people is the other way around, that mind can move from the outside to the inside. And there's a few things to say here. First, there's the enactivist piece, which is to say that minds are enacted, they're extended into their environment. And that, of course, reminds me of Bateson, because Bateson said, when we're talking about this, why are we stopping at a brain? Why aren't we including the nervous system? If we're going to include the nervous system, why don't we include the whole body? If we're going to include the whole body, why don't we include the environment that the body's in? If we're going to include the environment that the body's in, why don't we include the environment that the environment's in? So on and so forth. And so there's this kind of ecological cascade. So there's all of that. But also there's something very interesting developmentally for people that I guess a lot of lay people perhaps aren't aware of, is that a subject, a self, is not born from the inside out, but it's actually born from the outside in. And what I mean to say is that you arrive in the world as an infant, with this upregulated nervous system, and you emerge into relationship, you emerge into an environment, and that environment, by being supportive and nurturing and caring for you, creates down-regulatory and supportive effects. But even more importantly, and again, this is where Russell Mears has kind of got a lot to say, as well as Alan Shaw and Dan Siegel, and of course all the attachment people, is that actually what happens is that the caregiver begins a relationship with this infant whereby they adopt the position of the subject that is not yet formed. And what I mean by that is to say that if I've got my daughter in my hands and she's 4 months old and I'm nursing her and she's crying, I'll find myself saying things like, "Oh, what's wrong, sweetheart? Are you hungry? Are you? Or do you need a cuddle? Or do you need a change? Don't worry, Daddy will take care of you." What's happening there is that the more advanced human subject is adopting a position of narrativizing the role of a subject which hasn't actually emerged yet. And it is in this relational field of adherence and attunement to the needs of the infant that the infant begins to pair its experiences, his internal experiences, with the environment and with outcomes. So eventually what starts to happen is the infant begins to notice that when I feel this way, I want this. And of course, the presence of I there is that very first beginning, even just the desire, an individualized desire, my desire, what I want, what I need, this is mine. That becomes the seed of the self, and that emerges over time. Now, that's very important, because what that then starts to tell us is that in the infant caregiver dyad, the mind is extended at least into a field of two, at least. So when I say that the outside and the inside are interconnected in this way, hopefully that makes a bit more sense.
It does. I mean, to kind of give I don't know, perhaps a more radical version of that, to make it really just come home for people, you're basically saying like the virtual self pre-exists the actual self, or the avatar pre-exists the self that it is supposed to be a projection of. It's actually the other way. Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you, Tra-ill. All right, so we might leave it there. I mean, the other part, but I think we'll get to this, is the stages and states. But I think we'll get to that when we start speaking about metacognition. And one thing I wanted to ask you um, uh, was about the kind of the history of the development of the idea of metacognition, how that relates to organization of mind, and the kind of how can I say, the lineage of thinkers in this regard, and how it connects psychological research to spiritual practice. But we'll get there. So the next section after the section on what is mind is what is trauma, so you've started with mind, and it's only once you've dealt with mind that you go into the question of what is trauma. Now, just to remind people of how you conceptualize trauma, being a disorder of time, defense, relationality, and communicability, memory, resource, and agency. So those are the kind of, and then you go systematically and you talk about trauma in relation to each of these things, and we'll get there. But you begin by just saying that trauma is a response to experiences, one, and generally involves some form of psychological shock.
Yeah. So,
And
let's pause there, Josh, because this is really important, right? There is no such thing as a traumatic experience
yeah,
independently of an experiencer. Yeah. So people would like to believe that any terrible thing that happens by definition is always already traumatic. And
yeah,
no,
no,
that's exactly not the case.
yeah,
Because I mean, the research we know this is unequivocal research. You can have two people exposed to the same stimuli, one will develop trauma, one won't.
yeah, yeah,
So it's not the experience itself, it's the experience of the experiencer,
yeah, yeah,
and that's very, very important.
yeah. I mean, we can understand that really in relation to a definition of stress, right? Which is you've got stress is not the event, it's the stressor, and then putting that into kind of an equation with the resources of the organism that faces the
That's right.
stressor. So if the organism doesn't have the resources that are equal to the demands of the stressor, that's a stress. And that can
That's
then
exactly
become traumatic stress, right?
that's
Yeah,
exactly right, and that's why one of the vectors that I say from in terms of performing a phenomenological reduction of trauma is that it's a disorder of resource.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's one way of thinking about it.
Yeah, great. So one of the things you speak about in this introductory, the early part of this section on what is trauma is the difference between omission and commission. So perhaps you can just outline these terms and why is it important to begin there?
Yeah, well, I think the notion of omission and commission is very important, because if we're talking, we're trying to find real categorizations, right? We're trying to find meaningful categorizations of understanding trauma, and I think if we say that trauma is something which is an unexperienceable experience, to use kind of Kathy Karath's kind of ideas there for a moment, it was an unexperienceable experience. Well, it's not just in the form of violence. And I think that's how most people would initially think about it. And what we might say there is that commission is what's done to you. And so you are raped, you are in war, you are in a fire, these things happen to you. And so, in some sense, there is a commission upon the subject. Something has happened to you. Omission is different. Omission is traumatic in exactly the same kind of ways. That is to say, it's a threat to one's existence in some ways, but it happens normally by not getting what you need, and it's often very connected to early life developmental processes. And so it's very, very, very connected to things like neglect. Now, what we know is that what is protective of people in the face of commission, for example, events, is being securely attached and having an absence of omission in their history, because it increases their resources, right? So when we have people who have a strong history of omission, particularly early developmental omission and neglect, we know through ACEs research, that those people are much more likely to then be on the receiving end of commission events in adulthood. And so there's an interrelationship between these terms and these ideas, but they are very important distinctions to be made. And we just might want to say that an infant who's not cared for, a child who's not fed or is not cared for and loved in the ways that it needs as a developing being, that's a threat to that infant's existence. Its survival is completely contingent on a caregiver. And if that caregiver is not able to give that, then it can produce these omissive effects, most notably in things like disruptions of the attachment system.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so with that grounding, we're going to go into the first kind of category in which trauma may be conceptualized, and this is time. So you write that trauma is a specific process and manifestation of human catastrophe, which can be structural, personal, or historical in nature. And I was hoping we could explicate those words, and in particular your reference to structure, the personal and the historical.
Structural trauma, this is Agnes Heller, I think, that originally uses that triad, but structural means that it's structured into life. So birth, for example, Otto Rank famously said that in birth, every person is a hero. I mean, it's hard to imagine an experience as confounding and difficult as birth, for example. Equally, we could say perhaps death, approaching our own demise. These are structural features. These are baked in to being a person. You can't get away from them. And so these are experiences that may, as we said earlier, create a kind of traumatic response. And, there has been a lot done, for example, in the birth space. Otto Rank wrote about it, and I guess the only other person that's really done a lot of writing about it is Stanislav Grof. But, whilst his perinatal matrices are very interesting and there's a lot of colloquial kind of elaboration on their implications and their meaning, I'm not familiar with any substantive kind of research into it as that's scientifically sound. But this is what we mean by structural, that there are these features that we are always already going to encounter, and that they can be disruptive for people. The personal, I think, speaks for itself. This is what most people would kind of think about and talk about when we think about these ideas, and they really has a lot to do with those things that we experience that we can't experience as people, and the omission and commissions, the things that happen to us or don't happen to us. That's the register of the personal. But then this historical is interesting, because the historical, the trans-historical, and the transgenerational, intergenerational are kind of mixed terms. And so what I might say here is that all of us who are alive today are impacted by the trauma of the Holocaust. We carry it with us in certain kinds of ways, even if it is merely the view that human beings have the potential to do something as evil as engage in the Shoah, as engage in this mass genocide of a people. It means something to us. It impacts our minds. It has an influence on us. That shouldn't be mistaken for something which is intergenerational, and I use this example of the Holocaust for this example, the intergenerational effects of Jewish peoples who were involved in the Holocaust. And that is to say that those who suffered at the hands of the Nazis, those who survived the camps, there is something which is then directly transmitted into their lineage. Now, there has been some research into epigenetical phenomenon, around that, but I think in some ways that may or may not be true, but at least at a psychological level, we can understand that people who are traumatized are going to find it very difficult, for example, to meet the needs of their children in adequate ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So these intergenerational effects just keep carrying on. And you could pick any number of examples. The North Atlantic slave trade has produced a plethora of problems in the United States, and the African American experience still deals with the effects of the intergenerational trauma, which has been caused by slavery, Jim Crow, Jane Crow, and all the subsequent issues that have preceded it. And so it's to say that we are, to do a bit of a Heideggerian pun for a moment, we might want to say that we're beings under trauma.
Mm-hmm.
That part of our temporalized existence, part of our way of coming into the world, means that we are potentiated for this, because you can't really talk about trauma without talking about the other side, which is violence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, Walter Benjamin, said that history was a trail, a river of blood and wreckage, and I think that that's true. And most of human history is plagued with catastrophic violence upon ourselves, upon the ecosphere, upon others, upon animals, upon whatever it is, this catastrophic level of violence. And in some ways, it marks an interesting moment in history today, where for the first time, we haven't had whole generations of people shipped off to be slaughtered. Whole generations of people. And so in some ways, I often, in my more charitable moments, I like to think that this whole identity politics and woke movement in some ways is a reaction against our history of violence, and actually is an attempt, albeit I would argue a flawed attempt, to try and create a radical sensitization to each other and the world. And so it's this interesting moment. So when Heller talks about structural, personal, and historical, I think those are really important issues to think about. And one of the features about my work around trauma is that I'm not really just interested in the psychological accounts of it. I'm using Agnes Heller there, a very famous philosopher. I think literature has a lot to say. Often when I'm teaching trauma, I think the best book to help people understand trauma that's ever been written is Toni Morrison's Beloved. I think no book gives you a better insight into what trauma really means on so many levels.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, does that make sense, Josh?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it's a great expansion of explication of that quote. Really, yeah, makes me want to go read Heller for sure. So you speak about trauma as involving a detemporalization and repetition, and there's a kind of an endlessness to trauma.
Yeah.
And never dying, if I can put it that way. Like
it's never placed into the past.
Yeah.
Heidegger says, we're beings are, like this notion that we import ourselves into our future from our past. One of the features, and perhaps this is some of my interest in it, is that trauma is exactly not that. It is exactly not that. It is not us as historical beings, but rather it places us into a situation where we're unable to place this experience into the past because we can't experience it. And so there's a sense in which trauma has a horizon that never really collapses. It's always alive. It's always there. It's always in action. It's always playing itself out. And so if it's unable to be placed into the past, then it means that the person never really has a history and really never has a future, but rather lives in this hellish space, which we might articulate through traumatic symptom. But rather, when you start to think about it like that, it starts to become much more profound when you realize that people having flashbacks and other such experiences are in a state where they are being disallowed a future. Their capacity to experience a future is not present. And I would, philosophically argue that the experience of the possible is what generates hope. And so there's this incredibly painful world where that temporalized state creates an inescapability. And so one of the things that I often say is that trauma work is about turning trauma into suffering. Because in contrast to trauma, suffering is profoundly temporal. Yeah, I stub my toe, it really hurts. But it diminishes over time, it changes over time. Even if I'm dying of cancer, I might be in a kind of constant pain, but that pain diminishes and changes. There is a sense of which there is a past, a present, and a future. In a traumatized state, that's not the case. That there is no diminution. And so when we're doing exposure work, for example, I would say that what we're doing is we're taking the unexperienceable experience and we're beginning to experience it in a manageable way so that it can be turned into a suffering. As it's turned into a suffering, it can be relegated to a past, which allows the possibility of a future.
So it seems like we're in the place where the right place to ask, for me to ask this question. Trauma is a kind of eternal present. But trauma treatment and psychotherapy treatment, there's a whole kind of orientation within certain schools of psychotherapy to treatment in the here and now. And on the face of it, this seems like a kind of a contradiction. How do you treat a problem of an eternal present by focusing so like intensely on the here and now? I think you were kind of answering that question already before I asked this. You was by speaking about experience, but maybe you could speak to this.
The there and then is always in the here and now. But equally, I would say that when we're doing this work, there is nothing but the here and now. Now, I'm working with a soldier who has been, in Iraq or Afghanistan or somewhere, and he's had friends killed and he's sustained his own injuries and these kind of things. And he's sitting in the room with me and he's looking around, his eyes are darting, he's tapping his foot, he's anxious, he's activated. Why? Because his body is responding as if he is still there. It's still happening. It hasn't gone away. It's right there. It's right there with us. Right there. And whilst he might be physically and objectively in a different time, in a different space, there's a whole part of him which just does not register that. That's just not what's happening. And yeah, that's a conundrum.
Interesting. Thanks, Tra. I had this notion of maybe discussing Nietzsche in relation to your work on trauma, the philosopher Nietzsche, a great influence for you, and I'm sure there's something to say. But perhaps if there's we come back to Nietzsche because I'm sure that could be a discussion in and of itself for you.
That's a different podcast, I think.
Yeah. All right. So you draw an interest in relation. We're spending quite a lot of time on time, and maybe that's justified. But yeah, one thing I noted was in your discussion of disorganization of time and trauma, you refer to, on the one hand, there's some kind of disorganization or disruption to the functioning of the HPA axis, There's an overactivation in particular. But there's also a disruption of metacognitive functioning. Now, it seems to me you're pointing to at least two features of the disorganization of time that occurs in trauma, and that's a psychobiological kind of wing, if I can say that, and then a very much a psychological, cognitive maybe, or metacognitive, of course, wing. And I'm just wondering, why gesture towards both, or what's the importance of doing that?
Well, I mean, metacognition is an incredibly important part of understanding psychotherapy and psychotherapeutic practice and mental disorder. I don't think there's a single psychiatric disorder that doesn't involve some kind of diminishment of reflective function or metacognitive capacity. So it's really important to kind of think about that. Now, I'm not saying all the mechanisms are the same, there's lots of differences, but in this case, what we're seeing is there's an interconnected effect, is that when we get increased reactivity, we get an activation of our survival-based reactivity, then what by definition we're doing is diminishing the integration of the nervous system as a whole. And in particular, we're seeing the diminishment of near frontal cortex and a whole bunch of other kind of complex operations there. So this notion is important for a few reasons, because we might say that integration is important, yeah, but integration is synonymous with regulation, and regulation is synonymous with integration. So that these things are paired with each other. Increased metacognitive capacity is going to prevent people collapsing into that survival-based reactivity, and increases in the survival-based reactivity are going to diminish the reflective capacities. And so they're really paired, and what we need to do is be able to regulate those experiences to maintain that total integration of the nervous system to allow for the optimized metacognitive capacities of the individual to function. And so they really are very, very neatly wedded to each other in some ways. So I would say that when we're doing psychotherapeutic work around trauma, you know, ideas like the window of tolerance and all those ideas, which are very popular and very, you know, rightly so, very important. Perhaps one of the missing pieces is for what purpose? Yeah. So a regulatory activity, for example, a bottom-up regulatory activity is great, but the net effect of that regulation is a integration of the complete neural and psychological capacity of the individual. So it's really important to understand both of those, I think.
Great. You also, in this section on time, speak about the limitations of catharsis in trauma treatment. I'm just curious, what does this have to do with time? Why was this reference to catharsis and its limitations in trauma treatment included in this section on time?
Well, there is a sense in which, if we're not careful, you know, just catharsis by itself, you know, it is, you know, often been a feature that, you know, many people have sought for the treatment of trauma. I'm not saying that it's not important in trauma treatment, by the way. I think catharsis is an important mechanism of change. But really what I'm saying is that catharsis alone is not really going to do the work for us. It's really quite impossible in some ways to move on, I would say, within trauma. You know, that might be one way of saying it. It's, by definition, you don't move on within trauma because it's self-enclosing, it's self-limiting, it has those features to it. Rather, what we need to do is to be able to take those experiences and turn them into something else. And so, yeah, suffering is important, and the cathartic moment is important. If catharsis is done the wrong way, it will re-traumatize people. Yeah. that's done outside of their capacity to tolerate. It will re-traumatize them. But I would also begin to argue that there's something actually much more important, which is that when we are in this process of catharsis, we're cleansing, we're moving some feeling, we're doing something. What next? Then what? And so in my work, what I really focus on a lot of the time is finding creative means to transfer that material into, to find something generative in that cathartic energy, if you like. To take the pain or the suffering or the hurt and transpose that into paint and pigment or music or movement or something. Because I can't help but feel that in some ways the simplest categorization of trauma is this collapse of potential and possibility. And so the radical opening into states of possibility, particularly if you're using that traumatic experience as a fuel for that, can be really profound.
Great. Okay. So moving on to another section, and just being mindful of time here as well. So the next concept of importance is that of defense, and this relates to trauma as something inexperienceable. Trauma is something that's outside of experience, it's outside of time. You write that the basis of repression can thus be seen as the protection of ego integrity from material that is too dangerous for the psyche to consciously experience, or in another register, trauma denotes a process surrounding events that cannot be experienced and therefore also cannot be temporalized as discussed above. Yet trauma may well be understood, and this is the thing I was hoping you could just explicate a little bit, may also be understood as the defensive phenomenal process of the avoidance of experience, in parenthesis, the latent manifestation, as well as the failure of this defensive structure or mechanism, the gross manifestation. Yeah, so just hoping you can unpack that for me.
So I think, we can see trauma as having defensive characteristics. That, as I say, it's repressive. You see the kind of ways in which the person might respond to a situation. We'll see a whole series of defensive patterns activated, right? That makes sense. But also, perhaps more profoundly, trauma is the collapse of the defensive structures. That when it emerges as symptoms, when it emerges in its features, it becomes eruptive. And that eruption is the failure of defense. And if I think about that, that failure of defense, this kind of catastrophe which can erupt, this is where you can see decompensation. This is where you can often see the most extreme manifestations of it, is when the defensive structures have collapsed. But there's always, in some ways, a kind of inkling that it's coming. There's always some sense. It never arrives. It's not that the person is fully functional and then collapsed. There are symptoms. There are telltale signs. There's a whole bunch of things which happen, and if we intercede in between these areas where we have the defensive organization itself and the collapse, this is often where most people get treatment. I think they instinctively understand that they need to do something before it's too late, so to speak. But traumatized decompensation is when all the defenses are gone. And that can be very, very dire in a clinical setting. That can be, that's very, very serious. And so when we're treating people, I think having a sense of the temporalized features we were speaking about earlier, also has us understand that trauma, I like to say, decants over time. The chickens come home to roost. And what's in between the experience and its appearance? Defense. And so I've had many patients just say, I've just got a black hole down here and I just stick this stuff in here and it's never coming out. Full stop. But of course, the unconscious and the psyche might have other ideas. And so it's not uncommon for people to go through a terrible experience and then 10 years later begin to develop symptoms.
Yeah.
And so I like to have this kind of image in my mind of these unexperienced experiences gnawing their way through the person's defensive organization, just gnawing at them in order to erupt into the world, calling out to be claimed. So the unclaimed experience is always calling out. And in this regard, this is kind of what I didn't really expand on before when I was talking about symptoms and creativity. One of the ways that I like to think about symptoms as meaningful expressive acts, that perhaps that's the only expressive agency that the person has, is the development of a symptom. But nonetheless, it's a communication of importance. It's speaking about something. It shouldn't be just, on a dot point list of that's present. No. Well, what does it mean that it's present? What's the nature of its presence? How is it appearing? What is it like? These are the kind of questions.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and one thing I'm taking away from this, just from a bit earlier, was the importance of defense. So the defense is something that's it is finally maladaptive, but it still has formed in order. It's a protective thing, and if you just take that away, you're going to. And I guess this links back to catharsis and the limitations of the catharsis. If you just take the defense away suddenly without building something else, some other resources there, you're doing great harm to this person. Yeah,
that's right. We should never take away a defense without something else to take its place. And the defensive organization of the psyche is an important feature of it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's essential.
Yeah, great. So just moving on to relationality and communicability, you've kind of started going there, and you've already like early on in this discussion spoken about the incredible importance of the relational feature of our development, but also the relational features of trauma. And you say that trauma disrupts the mind at biological and symbolic levels, but it also has profound effects on the relational capacities of trauma sufferers. And then you quote Dostoevsky, "What is hell? I maintain that it is the suffering of being unable to love."
Yeah, it's a great quote, isn't it?
It's a great quote. And so, yeah, the importance of maybe just if you, without going into that quote in and of itself, maybe just something about the importance of literature here for you. You've mentioned Beckett, you've mentioned Toni Morrison. Why does literature have a place in the thinking of trauma for you?
Well, I mean, I'd probably widen it a little bit and say that literature has a huge place to play in the role of the subject. And I mean, the history of the novel, what it was, you don't really get much personal insight, into Odysseus when you read Homer. There's not a lot. There's not a lot of the interiority of the present in the writing. So these great sagas and poems and whatnot, that predate the novel is really, synonymous with the formation of the interiority of the self as we understand it today, the private personal self. Charles Taylor, of course, has written a lot about that. And this idea of literature is that many of these artists, many of these great writers, what they're able to do is understand rather than explain or describe, And so the value in psychotherapy, I think, is much greater than is often present in training curriculums. Yeah. If you really want to understand, perversion or something, like you're not really going to get it from reading a textbook, but you read Hallebeck or Roth or someone like that. There's often these ways of understanding the interior dynamics of those experiences. I mean, if you want to really get a feel for the quality of sociopathy and psychopathy, perhaps reading something like Hannibal really elicits a deeper understanding of the qualities of what it's like. So I feel like literature does this beautifully, and great literature, like this really, these really important pieces of literature that we've spoken about do it. And I don't think it's historical only. I think, as someone you're deeply kind of interested in, Cormac McCarthy, I mean, his capacity to capture some of these qualities is profound. And so reading in that way informs the therapist in a way that I think other modes of reading just can't do. I think that's really what it. If you want to think about it in a different way, mentalization, the capacity to hold my mind and another's mind in mind. When I read fiction, what I'm doing is not only holding my mind and another's mind in mind, but I'm actually forming another's mind in my mind. And that mind is forming me in certain ways. And then there's the mind of the author. So there's all these complex mentalizations are happening in the reading.
Yeah.
So I think that literature is, under-serviced in our profession. I think it has a lot of value to offer people, and I certainly think that that's something that we should be more focused on.
Yeah, great. It reminds me of philosopher Cornel West speaking about the foundations of his thinking as a philosopher being rooted in the blues, right? So in an aesthetic tradition, the ability to kind of to articulate suffering.
Yeah, well, I mean, that of course, it's great that we're talking about Brother West, but this aesthetic tradition, this blues aesthetic tradition you're talking about there, this beginning with suffering, reminds me of Adorno when he says in Negative Dialectics, the condition of all truth is to let suffering speak. And so I would say that we are caught up in psychological and psychiatric frames of kind of quantities. But what we're really missing are qualities. And when we're talking about an aesthetic, we're really talking about a series of qualities, not quantities. And that then moves us back into the register of Bateson and a whole bunch of other important people. But an aesthetic psychology might be exactly what's needed to really understand.
Great. There's so much here. We're gonna have to move on into. I want to cover each of these kind of. Well, I might have to be a little more modest here. I might just move us through quickly by just kind of bookmarking some things for people who will be watching this. The importance with regards to memory, so trauma memory, the importance of forgetting as an organizing process in trauma treatment. So again, this ties back to overcoming trauma as an eternal present, that it becomes a past for the person. When you write about trauma, resource, and agency, there's this quote: trauma creates a disruption to agency as the traumatic process itself often takes the form of an agentless agent within the mind of the sufferer, seeming to not just undermine internal resources, but also agency itself. And in relation to this quote, I guess it made me think of the things you say about voice, that trauma seeks a voice, trauma seeks to speak. And I guess I'm curious about the relationship between that voice, that urge to enunciate, and the self-organizing qualities of mind that you've spoken about before. And then I guess just another time, the relationship of all of this to poetry, which we started to touch on, poetry, song, prayer, and mantra as a kind of verbal, linguistic way of shaping the world or reshaping the world.
Yeah, that's a big question. Yeah, look, I mean, I think if we're thinking about the way in which traumatic material demands to be heard, Kathy Karath talks about that. It cries out to be addressed. That's one feature, but there's also this other feature where perhaps it's introjective. I mean, I don't know, perhaps it's a kind of interpretation of the feeling, but because there is a quality of something inside of me which is not integrated into me, it can't help but be experienced as a kind of otherness.
Mm.
And that quality of otherness can very easily take on a form of alien presence.
Mm.
Something is doing to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this doing to quality which then creates a repetition of what was done to you or to the person. And so there's these interesting kind of connections there, isn't there, between,
Yeah.
allowing ourselves to have these experiences in ways that allow them to be integrated, to be felt, to be processed, which in turn means that they're not experienced as alien, but rather as present, as part of my experience, which then passes out of me in a different kind of way. So
Mm.
I think that's how I describe it. There's this kind of quality of otherness and alienness, which then begins to kind of replicate a pattern of being done to.
Mm-hmm.
Albeit the done to-ness of it is because of the defensive organization and the way that it's seconded out of the rest of experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Okay, we're going to move on to the section of organization of mind, and regrettably don't know if we have all of the time that would justify this section. But I guess in the first instance, I'm wanting to know, what is the relation between this concept of organization of mind and metacognition? Are they synonymous? Does that depend on?
No, they're not synonymous. I mean, they're connected, right? They're connected values and ideas. So we might say, like when we talk about organization of mind, it appears in lots of ways within psychological literature, but without really clear articulation, actually. So we look at organization of mind, if we think about that idea, obviously the organization of the nervous system is the obvious way that people will talk about and think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look up organization of mind, you'll find Shallis and Cooper's work. If you look up disorganization of mind, you'll find the very fine work of Eric Kandel. But I always make this kind of point that we said earlier is, brains are not minds and minds are not brains. They're correlated and connected, but they're just absolutely not the same thing. And if they were the same thing, why would we have two different terms to describe the same thing?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you might as well just call it brains.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of slippage, terminological slippage, and philosophical sloppiness that goes into some of that thinking. So that's problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Freud drew on ideas of psychical organization, which dates back to Genet's writings. People like Allport were talking about organization. When we think about Kohut and Kernberg and those ideas around various forms of psychological organization and organizational patterns of personality, I guess probably Nancy McWilliams has kind of extended that work. So this whole tradition of speaking about organization. But if we just take a moment there and just say, well, what does it mean for something to be organized? It's really a way of talking about the relationships between whatever the properties are.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really what we're talking about, and to say that there is something there in this organizational pattern. Here, again, Bateson, I think, is very important, because what we're really talking about here is the relationships to whatever these parts are, whatever we're talking about here, these dimensional aspects. And so that's a really important feature, because that's really what's changing. Of course, Bateson famously asked the question, what's the difference that makes the difference?
Mm-hmm.
The difference that makes the difference. And it's some form of information which rearranges the relationships. The dimensional aspects are the same, but the configuration is different.
Mm-hmm.
The other term which is kind of present here, and I'm not sure how much I mentioned it in the article, of course, is coherence. And so
Mm.
coherence, mind, and organization of mind are often used interchangeably. And coherence has slightly different, evokes slightly different ideas. Coherence, something can be cohered, it can be stuck together. But I always think of coherence more in terms of amplitudes, that we have two waveforms connecting with each other, and when they cohere, they increase in amplitude. And so there's something about the integration of the total system here that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of at play. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other stuff we could say about that, but I think it's kind of a bit pointless.
Yeah.
But to bring this, to bring this back to your question about metacognition, the first kind of, articulation around metacognitive organization, Mary Main's work, one of the key scores is on, coherence of mind. They're looking at this capacity of the mind in the AAI for reflective and agency, So Favel's kind of original notion of metacognition was just thinking about thinking, but it's become much more than that.
Mm-hmm.
It's become much more than that. And as it's kind of developed through Fonagy and Bateman and Allen and DiMaggio and Semieri and Leitziker and, all those people, and Dan Brown and David Elliott and all those wonderful people, we've started to get a different kind of feel or way of thinking about what psychotherapy actually is. One way we might talk about it is to say that all psychotherapy is involved in the development of organization of mind.
Mm-hmm.
All psychotherapies are describing, through either scientific or folk psychological means, disorganization of mind.
Mm-hmm.
And all of them are proposing possible remedies for the organization or reorganization of mind. That's become very interesting in the psychedelic assisted therapy space as well, with this articulation of notions of a default mode network, essentially, where we're talking about these substances which disorganize the brain, which disorganize the mind, which then, with the right help, can create reorganizing positive experiences. So these ideas are really connected.
Yeah, great. Tra-ill, I think that really kind of is a good place to start wrapping this up. It's been really a really rewarding conversation. I thought I might just ask, as a way of ending, this was part one. So what can we expect from part two in a little in a nutshell? And when can we expect to be able to read it?
I'm not sure when it's going to be published. I'm not sure how frequently the journal is publishing at the moment, but part two is more of an overview of the practice literature, the models and therapies that are being used, and using, I guess, the first principles that are outlined in this paper to create a kind of cohesive way of integrating the use of existing models. And what I would say is that all psychotherapies have utility. All of them are good. There is no this is the right way to treat trauma. This, sensomotor processing is the only way. No, somatic experiencing is the only way. No, CBT is the only way. No, I think they're all partializations. And those partializations require integration. They require a meta view that can hold them all together, that can help clinicians select well on how to approach. And so really what that comes down to is providing thinking tools, or formulation tools, if you like, ways of thinking about trauma in a meaningful way that allows the person to formulate, which then allows them to select an appropriate treatment approach in order to help the people that they're working with. And what I think is important about that is also delimiting what we might call auxiliary trauma treatments, which are really focused on regulatory support versus kind of processing models of treatment. And I think both of those should be paired together. So I don't think yoga is ever going to be a solution in and of itself for most trauma sufferers. For some it may, but it's an auxiliary treatment. Same with flotation therapy or horticultural therapy or equine therapy or any of these things. They are really important auxiliary therapies that can be used in conjunctions with a kind of what we might call a primary processing approach, which should really be focused on dealing with the person at the level of organization where they're disrupted and beginning there. So that's what the second piece is kind of focused on and trying to think about.
Sorry, just to make a connection with something that we didn't discuss, but that is mentioned in the paper we discussed today, is the difference between trauma as a category with universal features and trauma as an individual experience with specific manifestations, and your term, meaning complexes. And it seems to me that you were addressing that, like the trauma treatment needs to be adequate to the specific meaning complexes of the individual traumatized person.
That's right. Yeah. This notion of inherent meaning complexes is just so important, and I think it's underdone. This idea that, all right, I've got PTSD and I'm a soldier. Is that the same as I've got PTSD and I'm a rape victim? And is that the same as PTSD of somebody who was a fire victim? Right? No, they're all different. Yet they meet the same category. And if I was to treat them all the same, then I'd be in real trouble. And then within the category of soldier, every single soldier who has PTSD has a different presentation of that disorder.
Yeah.
And so it is the inherent and implicit meaning complexes that we have to understand if we're to really do the work, I believe. And to bring this full circle, I would say that understanding is in of itself the beginning of treatment. Like that is the heart and soul of it, actually, is understanding.
Wonderful. Tra-ill, thank you so much for your time. This has been a fascinating discussion. I hope we can do this again sometime.
Pleasure, Josh. Any time for you, brother. Anytime.